Okay, welcome everybody to Search for Truth podcast. We are joined by Lynn, Stuart, Calvin, and Jake, and we are talking about whether or not we are living in a simulated reality, or a simulation, or a matrix, if you will. I was looking at a lot of quotes. My new favorite thing is to start this podcast with quotes, by the way, and there are so many great quotes that kind of potentially relate to this, and I picked several of them. One is from Galileo, actually, where he says that mathematics is the language in which God has written the universe, which I kind of liked. Of course, if you're talking about whether we live in a simulated reality, you assume it's simulated through a computer, and if that's the case, then you would expect that everything inside of it could kind of be boiled down to, mathematics or some sort of, programmable reality. Another is Einstein, by the way, had so many great quotes. He's got one that says, "Reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one." I'm not sure exactly what the context of that one is either, but I like it. And one that I thought was sort of good for inspiration for why we're tackling this particular issue. Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. I thought that was pretty cool. And then another great one is, computers are incredibly fast, accurate, and stupid. Human beings are incredibly slow, inaccurate, and brilliant. Together they are powerful beyond imagination. Which might be particularly relevant to our current situation. And of course, for people who are feeling like they're about to get red-pilled, there's the Morpheus quote from The Matrix, and this is your last chance.
One of the great thinkers of our time.
One of the great thinkers of our time, indeed. Morpheus says to, he's offering him the red pill and the blue pill, and says, "This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends, you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes." So one of the things I noticed in talking about this with people, right? I've mentioned that we were about to do this podcast. I was doing my homework on it, etc. And everybody there's like a super sharp reaction to this question. Whether or not they've thought about it before, the reaction to it is relatively severe. And there tends to be a divide between two groups of people. There's one group, the most common group, I would say, that immediately just says, "Nah, that's ridiculous. It's just totally, completely ridiculous. We don't live in a simulation." And there's another group that says, "Oh God, I hope so." and I've never run into somebody that was kind of like, "Oh, curious. Tell me more. Like, describe the situation so I can weigh in." So without any evidence whatsoever, everybody just immediately has an opinion. And I decided that if you could sort of draw the line according to who had the most to lose. So if, for example, people felt that their worldview mattered, right, that they were here for a reason, let's say they were Christians, or they believed in a God, or they believed that you would go to heaven, or maybe they've had loved ones die and they thought that those loved ones were in some special place or a heaven or something like that. I suspect that those are the people who would immediately say, "Oh no, it's ridiculous. We don't live in a simulated reality."
I wonder how much of it has to do with people that have given a lot of their lives in like self-sacrifice, and people that see like, okay, did I do this for nothing? Like if I spent 18 years raising a family, or 25 years raising a family, or whatever, and it was I'm sure they get a lot of satisfaction out of that. But people that sacrifice a lot, and then just to have the idea of like, well, it doesn't really matter. Like none of it really matters. It's all a simulation or whatever. I think that like they take that as a little insulting.
Yeah, like an insult.
Yeah.
Why, if it's a simulation, does it not matter? Not saying that that's a truth, but why do they have to think that?
So I think that's because they have their whole being and ideology or whatever just kind of wrapped around, whatever. Say they're a Christian or whatever, and then they're supposed to do X, Y, and Z throughout their life, and they do that, and they sacrifice for that, and then if that's not true, then they see it as like none of it being relevant, I guess.
I think it also probably has to do with the idea of heaven and hell. If this is a computer simulation, there probably isn't a heaven or a hell, and if they're living their lives in a good way so that they get to heaven, well, it was all for naught then.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair enough to say that there's definitely something on the line for people who believe that there is currently something on the line. If you're one of those guys who
should have brought someone in.
Well, I mean, I think there's a number of people who think that. Well, I mean, I don't know. I think a Christian, like commonly Christians would be the first people who would kind of be like, well, no, this is this is ridiculous. And the reason that they would immediately think that, of course, is because they have a certain worldview that they believe exists. I mean, it immediately brings, it immediately challenges the notion that there is a creator God and that, that Christ actually, was the Son of God and came and died and rose again, et cetera, et cetera. Their entire purpose and meaning and the reason, as you sort of said, Calvin, this idea that, hey, is everything I've done for naught? I think that's a legitimate concern. And, so one of the things I thought about was, Plato's cave in the Republic, where there's this.
That's a good one.
Yeah, for people who don't know, of course, there's people stuck in a cave and they're chained and they can't look around and there's a fire behind them and their reality, the only thing they've known are the shadows cast on the wall from people sort of walking around in the cave, between them and the fire. And then at some point, Plato suspects that somebody has found a way to loose themselves from their chains, and they turn around and they see the fire and it blinds them and they get scared and they immediately turn around back to the shadows. Now in the rest of the allegory, of course, at some point somebody drags them outside to see the world and the sun blinds them and all this stuff and they become enlightened. But it's that first reaction I thought was interesting, where you assume that your reality is these shadows and you know nothing else. And if somebody unchains you or you become unchained and you turn around and you see the fire and it hurts and you realize that what you thought was true was not true, the first inclination, of course, it's a story, but the first inclination, he suspects, is to turn around and go back to the shadows, not to be like, oh, what is this thing, and what does this mean, and is it possible I'm wrong? I think that's, if Plato's right, then this would be the perfect example, where people just immediately go, oh, don't be ridiculous, we're not in a computer simulation.
Yeah, it's self-protection. It's protecting the house of cards, like the house of cards.
Yeah, I think
it all comes down. Like if all of a sudden, to tie in what all you guys are saying, if all of a sudden this isn't the structure of reality, that all of a sudden you have to take these lenses through which you see things off, you got to rebuild from square one. And yeah, maybe the last 18 years is totally scrapped. Like in some sense, obviously, I wouldn't encourage someone to think that way, but yeah, you got to. It's just natural, to defend against that
mechanism, kind of.
Yeah, cognitive dissonance.
How much of that is caused by a literal interpretation of spiritual writings as opposed to being open to less than literal, Jesus coming back from the dead, a lot of crazy shit, impossible shit happens in the Bible. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, right. Yeah, I see what you're saying. I suspect that it probably the more literal. Well, it just depends on how seriously you take the truth of Christianity. I don't think you necessarily have to, if somebody believes that their life has a purpose, whether or not they're a Christian, and there's something on the line, right? I don't have to be a Christian to believe in a heaven or hell. And if I believe firmly that my parents have died and gone to heaven, then I have a lot to lose potentially by somebody insisting that this is a simulation. Right. Similarly, if I'm somebody who's well, I've become a Christian, but my whole family are not, and they're all going to hell. Well, I potentially actually have something to gain by this thing being a simulation. I think everybody's there's a spectrum, right? So
these things also aren't mutually exclusive, totally, right? It could be one of the religions is true, whatever, but they use, a computer in the future or whatever.
Yeah, it also changes. There would, I guess, still technically be a God if this was a computer simulation, except God would be the alien equivalent of a nerdy mouth breather.
Yeah.
Super nerdy.
Yeah, exactly.
Super nerdy.
Which I'm sure a lot of people would have a problem with, but some would, I think, accept that just as they don't know what it is, so it could be that.
Well, and it's worth pointing out that we wouldn't necessarily know the rules in advance, but a programmer who programmed this simulation could just as easily program a simulation where once you died, you went, a heaven and hell simulation as well.
Oh yeah,
where there are actual repercussions that, call them unreal at your own peril, because if you have to deal, if you have to suffer them, to be oh well, I'm suffering in hell, but it's just a simulation, so I probably shouldn't worry about it. It's well. Yeah, you still have to deal. It's as real as it gets for somebody like us if we have to come to grips with it.
Does anybody watch The Good Place? Okay, it's a TV show that basically takes place in heaven, but they figure out if you're supposed to go to heaven or hell by a point system when you're alive. And if you do enough good things and you reach a certain point level, you get to go to heaven, and if not, you go to hell. So it could be basically the same thing. Going to heaven or hell would just be leveling up or going to the next level or something.
I like that.
Well, so an interesting thing about simulation theory, not to short circuit that that line of thought necessarily, but I'm no doubt we're going to get back to it. But so simulation theory, by the way, is older. It's a lot older than we would expect because, well, if you can take, for example, Descartes' Meditations, which was published in 1641, the whole idea of cogito ergo sum. If I
think, therefore I am. Yeah.
I think, therefore I am, exactly. And so this idea, of course, where he was trying to doubt everything that he could conceivably doubt to see what was real. It's like, well, there's so many things I can doubt. Actually, I took one of the quotes from it that said, I shall suppose that some malicious, powerful, cunning demon has done all that he can to deceive me, and I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely dreams that the demon has contrived as traps for my judgment. So, that's
pretty paranoid.
It is, right? But it's like it was a philosophical, it was like a metaphysical, exercise, right? So, but the value, it is as close to the idea of, hey, let me see if I can figure out if this is kind of a simulation, without him knowing what a simulation was. There was no computers back then. And there's a guy, it goes back even farther depending on how you want to look at these ideas. There's this guy named Zhuangzi, maybe? I don't know, I'm not very good at Chinese pronunciation, but it's 369. He lived from 369 to 286 BC. And from the writings, the quote is, once upon a time, I, Chuang Chu, again, not sure about the pronunciation, dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither, a veritable butterfly, enjoying itself to the full of its bent, and not knowing it was Chuang Chu. Suddenly I awoke and came to myself, the veritable Chuang Chu. Now I do not know whether it was then Now I do not know whether it was then I dreamt I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming I am a man. That was in 300 something BC. So these ideas of how real is reality are super old, apparently.
Ancient, yeah.
Yeah, and then of course we got so many movies recently that have explored it, like obviously The Matrix, which is a little bit different because in a simulation, so there's a lot of different possibilities in the simulation. Maybe I'll mention this again later, but in The Matrix, the consciousness is in a world outside, and they're jacking into the simulation. So if the simulation ends, well, of course, in the rules in the movie are that if the simulation ends while they're in it, I guess they would all die, I guess, or something like that. I guess that's the idea. But the point though is that they can escape simply by getting out. Right? Neo escaped. Well, I don't want to give it away for anybody who's living under a rock for the last 20 years and hasn't seen The Matrix. But anyways, so the point though is that the consciousness exists outside. It is not created inside of the simulation, which is a little bit different from most of the simulation theory ideas. Is that the consciousness is actually generated inside, but it doesn't have to happen. The movie, I just recently rewatched The 13th Floor.
That's a good one.
Super underrated, super awesome.
Yep. Talks
Talks about the same idea. Inception, to a certain extent, kind of talks about, especially with the
rabbit holes.
Yeah, the rabbit holes, like how many, an inception inside of an inception turtles all the way down. There's a movie that I've not seen that you referenced called Dark City that apparently tackles this idea.
Yeah,
so it's
really
cool,
good.
right? Like it's a cool concept too, and those I think do a pretty good job of opening up ideas of genuine potential. I will say that I came into this extremely skeptical, and I still suspect it's probably not true, but the more I study this, the more compelling the argument becomes that this is a genuine possibility.
You don't want it to be true, or like emotionally don't want it to be true?
No, I think I'm relatively indifferent. The part of the frustrating thing about this is that it is extremely difficult to tell whether it's real or not, to test it in any meaningful way. Well, we'll get into that a little bit. Calvin's giving me a look, but we'll get into that. There are some ways that people are trying to test.
Damn it.
But it's a compelling thought, and if it's true, it's something I think worth knowing. Now, there is an argument of like, well, if we can't do anything about it, then what difference does it make? Well, maybe it makes no difference, but but it might, right? Like if you're a practicing Christian and you find out, let's say, that Christianity isn't true because we're in a simulation, for example, well, maybe you want to change the way that you do business around in life or whatever, right? Or the things that you're committing yourself to. That as an example. So there are some potential repercussions. It doesn't mean you're necessarily like, well, none of this matters, so I'm going to be a bad person. Well, you'll find out just how real, these simulation laws are when you commit a crime and they arrest you and throw you in prison, right? If we're a consciousness existing in the simulation and we're stuck with the rules, whether we like them or not, whether they're quote unquote real or not, they're real enough. And there is still, by the way, if we are a simulation, even if we're in a simulation, there was at some point in theory and still would be, right? An real world. Yeah, an original world, right?
Well, yeah. It has to kind of keep going, I guess.
With potentially similar, like laws of physics and similar rules, potentially even similar.
Wait, why is that? Why
Well,
has it got to
yeah.
be similar?
So here's the idea: is that
why has it got to be so similar?
it doesn't have to be similar. In fact, I make a point later that it's like, okay, let's say Super Mario Brothers. Actually, somebody else makes this argument.
Okay.
Super Mario Brothers, right? Like, let's say that Super
That was
Mario
you.
is running around and he's conscious though all of a sudden, and he can determine that he wants to measure out, how fast he can run, how high he can jump, what are the laws of his existence, what are the rules about what he can and can't do, and some programmer put those rules in there. But at some point, and the argument would go. And the argument does go. This was as far as the argument went, was how does he can't determine anything about the world outside by learning about the world that he is in. But I would argue actually that there are some educated guesses at least that he can make, because time is still linear. Physics still exists. Like, there are laws of physics. There is order. The world is visual. Like, there's certain things that for his world to be visual, he can assume that the world that created him probably has visual aspects. For example,
is it fair to assume that his deepest desire is to kind of climb up the pipe and destroy his maker, and to get some vengeance on the one that put him in this weird pipe world?
we would have to consult Freud possibly for something like this, but I don't know that. Well, I think it's safe to say, well, you can put yourself in that situation a little bit where you can say,
You're just a little Italian guy, pipes, mushrooms.
It doesn't sound like a bad life, to be honest. Is
Yeah,
he
I'm not
wanting
mad.
to, or
I'm
is-
not
I guess,
mad.
except for that he's always under attack by Goombas.
That's
Yeah.
true. But he's always got a purpose.
Yeah.
The evil reptilians
guess that's
stole his
Beats
girl.
being bored.
Yeah, he has infinite lives if you just keep resetting the simulation.
And he's got a hot girl waiting for him
At the
some
end of every
castle.
level.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's fair enough to say that, yeah, if he could get out up to where we are, maybe he wouldn't necessarily want to kill us, because we created him and we didn't create him for nefarious
He
purposes.
just wants to see what's,
Right. Yeah. He would
behind
just
the
want to be.
curtain.
Yeah. He would want to be to where it's like quote unquote more real, and he would want to see it. Which, again, there's a question of like, what is more real? Like, what if we are a simulation and we created him and we're like, hey, welcome to the new world, but unfortunately, it's like we're 60 simulations
Yeah.
deep, so you'll
You're gonna
never
have to
really
keep-
get there.
You're gonna have to keep going, buddy.
And it's worth pointing out, by the way, that he couldn't exist in this world. He is digital. That his consciousness would need to be
Have
implanted.
you not seen Tron?
Okay, well, let me put it to you this way. Again, it has to do with whether or not his consciousness has been generated inside of that simulation, or whether or not the consciousness is being jacked into the simulation. So if his consciousness could exist in this world, we could create a Super Mario Brothers where his consciousness could potentially exist in this world, and you simply have to take, like, let's say, for example, we build an android, and we just take and we create a Super Mario Brothers version that is so sophisticated that Mario is conscious, and then we manage to take the conscious code of Mario's brain, and upload it into this android's brain in our world. For all intents and purposes, now he exists in our world. So there are possibilities.
Now we're
there.
getting into like Blade Runner, AI, Bicentennial Man,
Yeah.
all the classics.
Well, but we don't know that our consciousness
Is that a classic?
But we don't know that our consciousness is not software. We don't know that. We don't know that ours has not just been generated with a bunch of ones and zeros.
Correct.
We're also
I would
making
agree with
assumptions based on our existence. Like, we make computers with ones and zeros, but that might be because our existence is actually ones and zeros. We don't technically know the nature of the computer that would have generated our simulation either.
But wouldn't you want to murder it if you were able to like climb up the pipes?
I'm sensing a theme here. Stuart.
Just beat the hell. That's like Jacob wrestling with God, right? What was
Yeah,
it?
there you
Or
go. Yeah,
Some guy.
yeah, Jake. I think that's right. Yeah.
I
Nice.
did have a thought though about the argument that some Christians might have, but they might come back and say, okay, this is a simulation, but in this simulation maybe there is a God and there was a Jesus and all this stuff happened. So for them, everything would still be true because all the stuff that happened in the Bible happened in our simulation. It doesn't necessarily blow up their interpretation of history in the world.
Yeah.
Well, so long as the repercussions are also true, because I think that might be the most significant part of Christianity for Christians, is the fact that you're serving a God who's real. You're serving it with actual, like, there are consequences after life,
Right.
for Christians, and so a lot of and it doesn't mean that Christianity has no. Like, there's no, that your life here is useless. Of course, they think that there's a lot that we're meant to be doing here on the planet. But I suspect if you really, really tried to pinpoint what most Christians thought was kind of the crux of it, it was to serve a God, and in that you are doing so with a fraction of your existence on this world, and that the vast majority of the time you're going to be doing that is after you die.
Right.
So if the repercussions are drastically different, and if I mean, God would still have to exist in some nature. I mean, now maybe literally let's say that we're 60 simulations deep, and every simulator has simply inserted the truth of the reality, so that we would have some understanding, the truth and the reality of the actual real world, 60 worlds up, and that there is some God, and that maybe God will have mercy on all of the simulated souls.
That'd be an interesting, why doesn't the Bible talk about how God deals with simulated souls? That should be in there.
Well, then the jig would be up.
The book of Atari.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Well, and interestingly enough, so I mean, this idea about the likelihood of our being in a simulated reality, I think, so a lot of people will kind of be like, okay, this is all well and good, but we're just not in a simulated reality. But there's some arguments you can make, and the most obvious one is, look, if we end up being able to create such a simulation where there is consciousness inside of a simulated world, and you can't really tell the difference between it and the quote unquote real world, which of course is also a little bit of a weird question to ask, because if you created the consciousness inside of the software, then how would it even know to question its world necessarily? Like, there's this assumption that the brain knows to question what's real and what's not. But Bill Nye makes an interesting point talking about this very topic, where he's like, there are instances in our world where children have been kidnapped till they were like 14 and just kept in a basement, and are brought and are rescued and are brought out and discover suddenly that there is a whole planet out there, like a whole world that they just didn't know existed. And he said there just doesn't seem to be any evidence that the brain is capable of questioning its reality on any kind of significant level. It just kind of accepts what is presented to it.
Yeah, if you do a good enough job to make to insulate someone, I think there's no reason why you would question your world like that. If you start to see, you see an animal that you've never seen run across the floor or something, where the hell did that come from? But yeah, otherwise, if you're completely insulated, in my mind, you wouldn't ever question what was going on.
But human beings have, collective consciousness is a thing. I don't know if y'all have read up on it, but they have similar images in their brain and similar, archaic figures in their brain that didn't necessarily apply to the world that they were in. I'm wondering if these people that were in the basement imagined of the world outside, to just think that we're kind of fixed machines. I mean, then what's an imagination? Did they only imagine little things that were in that room? I mean, it seems like images flash in that are kind of unexplainable and not necessarily
what they dream,
true to your own.
What they dream about.
But wouldn't you still consider them against the reality that you know? So you might be seeing these images, but I don't know if they necessarily make you think that there's a bigger world out there, just that you interpret it based on what, how you see the world. I don't know.
I'd have to think about that. I don't know. Something makes people want to get out of the basement, or human beings would just still be in tribes with a.
Well, I think it's because
sticks.
There's stimuli that makes them, you see light coming from beneath the door, and you say, where's that light coming from? You want to go up there. But if there isn't anything to kickstart your imagination, maybe.
Yeah, you have to at least be aware that there is something outside of the basement.
I don't know.
That's a good question. I mean,
we should write a paper called "How Plato's Cave Relates to Blast from the Past" with Brendan Fraser, and what it's
or
like.
Encino Man.
Yeah, Encino. There's a lot of Brendan Fraser connections, I think, to Plato's Cave and the nature of being in a sheltered reality.
I'm sure he's happy that somebody's talking about him.
I think this is a good idea because I didn't run over any of this in my research, actually. So this is brand new. You're really breaking ground here.
You
Stuart.
wasted your
Let's
entire
do a
time.
Brendan Fraser dedicated
Podcast.
episode next week.
I'm in.
Maybe he can join us. I don't think he's busy.
Yeah.
Aww.
That was sad.
Sorry, Brendan, for listening.
Sorry, Brendan. Now he's never going to get on the podcast.
God.
Sorry, I totally screwed that up.
Edit that out, yeah. Okay, so an argument toward simulation theory real quick about this idea that, okay, let's say that, let me back up just a little bit real quick, by the way. We'll do a little side note bit here. The simulation argument was actually first, but it's an educational minute for real quick. First published by Hans Moravec. I'm assuming that's. He's an Austrian born in 1948, adjunct faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University. He studied robotics, artificial intelligence, and the impact of technology. And the theory was then elaborated by Nick Bostrom, who was a Swedish philosopher born in 1973. So relatively recent, like the current argument as it goes, relatively recent. And that's understandable given the fact that computers, as we know them now, is relatively recent. Moravec, by the way, on a side note, there's this thing called Moravec's paradox, which is the discovery by artificial intelligence and robotics researchers that, contrary to traditional assumptions, high-level reasoning requires very little computation, but low-level sensor-motor skills require enormous computational resources. He writes, quote, "It's comparatively easy to make computers exhibit adult-level performance on intelligence tests or playing checkers, and difficult or impossible to give them the skills of a 1-year-old when it comes to perception and mobility." So I thought that was kind of cool. That's not super related to the topic, but totally awesome. So there's, of course, I mentioned two different possibilities. One is that our consciousness is, or a consciousness, or consciousnesses are created inside of the simulation, or that it jacks in from the outside. And by the way, I'd like to point out that there's a theory called solipsism that is it's the philosophical idea that only one's own mind is sure to exist. And so, I was making this case with our friend the other day at dinner, where technically you guys are pretty certain you're conscious because you're thinking. This sort of the Descartes kind of. Now, of course, if you read Nietzsche, he rips apart Descartes' assertion. I think, therefore, I am. But
really,
it's
I haven't read that.
Yeah, he flips it to I am, therefore I think, and then takes all these. He makes all these. He rips it apart because of the assumptions that are made due to language and all of these things. But in any case, everybody is dead certain about one thing, and that's that they are conscious, and they assume that everybody else is conscious because they act basically like they do. But there's really no way to prove that. I mean, in theory, all of us could be uniquely conscious inside of this world. Like you could imagine actually that the simulation is sort of like in a super futuristic world that we've created a program where over your lunch break you can go and jack in and live an entire life completely with super intelligent what do they call them in computer games? Non-player controlled NPCs. NPCs. Yeah. So but we assume that everybody else is conscious, but there's no way to prove that really at all. I mean, there's just not. So, but I'm not saying that I think that that's the case, but it is an interesting. Like, if you haven't thought about it, it's worth sort of walking around and kind of being like trying to think of ways that you could prove that you're not the only conscious being in the entire universe. But don't get too lonesome and don't take too many drugs when you start thinking about that.
I hope this doesn't take us down a rabbit hole.
Let's go.
Let's do it. What are we saying is consciousness? What are we trying to define consciousness as?
I don't have a definition for consciousness, although if I don't know if you're looking for a definition.
I
if
mean,
you just want a working definition, I would say maybe it's just the awareness of your own existence, maybe.
Okay.
That's about where I was going to go with it, yeah. It's a level of self-awareness where you can think about yourself thinking.
Yeah. You can think,
what we're told is like uniquely human, but no, why
I feel like dolphins probably do that.
Yeah, I was going to say dolphins.
Monkeys.
Octopus.
Octopus, yeah.
Octopus are aliens. Hashtag. Look it up.
Spit up my scotch here. So what were you getting at, Lynn?
No, I feel like that was a good.
Oh, okay.
I feel like I needed that.
Decent answer.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. So let's see. Yada yada. Yeah, so some of the reasons, by the way, that like people sort of say, oh well, why would they be running these things? There's a number of different. If somebody is curious about why somebody in the future might be running these things, it's there's the idea of. I mean, we already back test. We already run back tests, or like behavioral psychology might run certain tests, or science might run certain tests to just kind of see, hey, what happens if we put things in this scenario? Even economists are running computer simulations to determine how distribution of wealth might flow under certain circumstances and things like that. So you can imagine that if we got to the point where we can actually simulate an entire universe with conscious beings under similar condition or under certain conditions, or maybe similar conditions to the place it was created, that there's a lot of value to seeing how people behave. Is it deterministic? Do we end up with people exactly doing the same things you would expect all the time? Or, there's value to it because they could just be running tests.
Yeah, which is You didn't watch it, but that was kind of the idea behind Dark City. It was an
Now I
outside.
can't. Now it's ruined.
Yeah.
Well, it was similar to the
Spoiler
Matrix.
alert.
It was an outside. Well, it was an outside force that was trying to figure out what is uniquely human by observing humans and by constantly tweaking the environment and trying to figure out. Well, they have feelings, they have emotions, they're able to make decisions in a much different way, and we're just cold calculating kind of whatever external energy suckers from elsewhere. Yeah, who knows? I mean, if everything's on the table, yeah, why not? Why isn't this just like some sort of back testing going on?
Well,
Yeah.
I think it also gets into a question of morality too.
Yeah.
If you're going to run these simulations with conscious beings inside of it just to gain knowledge. Is it worth the pain that all of those conscious beings go through to garner some information? I don't know.
Well, it's
depending
worth-
on it, maybe.
It is worth considering that we don't know who's running the simulation. I mean,
They may not give a single
it
shit.
could be a 13-year-old running the
Yeah.
futuristic version of SimCity.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, we just don't know. Or a coding whiz who took a version of SimCity and found out a way, or just like implanted a consciousness
Sure.
code into it, and nobody knows he's doing it. I don't know. I mean,
Which is why I think video games are particularly interesting, because I don't know the video game, but I know there's one where at the very beginning it's like, are you going to be a good guy or a bad guy? Because this is the narrative. You're
Skyrim,
gonna
I
choose.
think,
Yeah, you're gonna choose one
or
path.
Fallout even. I think Fallout.
There's
is-
probably
Fallout
there might be
doesn't-
dozens of them, but to me, or hell, even like World of Warcraft, like you're in an environment where you consciously choose to either work with a group, or you could run around solo, or you could just be a dick. It's an amazing little petri dish of human experiment.
Yeah, well, and how often do we play games like, I mean, I remember playing Civilization where it was like 5 different ways to win, and I almost always chose world domination. I mean, it's like,
Explains a lot, John,
Yeah, or
yeah.
you build this, like, you build a Sim City, and you're just like, all right, well, time to send Godzilla through and destroy this city just for kicks. I mean, we don't know who created us and for what purpose, and we don't know that we're not a copy of a simulation with a purpose that is just being used for somebody's.
I feel like we've already all accepted this as totally a simulation. Let's back up and give us an argument.
Let me give you an
try to
argument.
give us a
Okay.
reasonable argument
Yes.
about how we're not in a simulation.
No, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do
It's
is
impossible.
because
You can't.
maybe people listening have kind of been like, look, this is all well and good, but I still don't think we're in a simulation. So here's the notion, right? So first of all, I just watched a video today about so you guys know the game Minecraft, right?
Yeah.
Minecraft?
Apparently all the kids Minecraft, all the kids are doing it. I guess it's the new thing. And you create, it's actually really low tech, technically. And you create a world, you build a world, and you can build kind of whatever you want. And apparently they have sort of a kind of I think it's called like a redstone or something like that. And it's a maybe electricity simulator of sorts. And so somebody got on and built an iMac computer with a keyboard in there, and you
Holy
can
crap.
and he was like showing that you could just step on the keys on the keyboard and the letters would show up on this computer. Then he goes into the computer to show what this guy did to build it, and it is to my eyes astronomically complex. Now somebody sat around
Wow.
and bothered to build this thing just for kicks in their free time. Now it must have taken them forever, I would think, and I don't know, I don't play Minecraft, but I would think that this must have taken a really long time. So let's assume, one, that technology is going to continue to advance to a high, like at an increasingly rapid rate, or even if it's just at the same rate as it currently is. Everybody's trying so desperately not to make noise right now. I
I
appreciate
feel like
the
I'm
effort,
like
guys.
sneaking
I
around, like
appreciate
sneaking
that.
out of the house as a kid, just trying to pour a whiskey without making noise.
So let's assume that technology is going to continue to advance to the point where basically you can't tell the difference in a simulation, or maybe we could develop consciousness. Now, it's one of the big rubs of this thing, by the way, as a side note, is that consciousness is so not understood by science right now. I mean, there is such a lack of understanding about what consciousness is, how it's generated, whether it's generated, is it emergent, there are people who think that our brain is just really an antenna for consciousness, and so there's so many questions regarding consciousness that would have to get not necessarily answered, but at least practically solved, I think, to potentially either put consciousness into a computer or to generate consciousness inside of a computer. But at the same time, you can imagine at the rate where technology is advancing now. I mean, some guy just built, a computer inside of Minecraft, which was never designed.
It doesn't
to do
really
anything.
matter the rate as long as it's increasing. Like at some point,
Yeah, give it enough time.
we'll get there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if that's the case, then at some point we will very probably be able to create a simulation just like the one that we are arguing that we might be in. And if we create such a simulation and it's genuinely believable, and let's say it mirrors our own world, and it has all the same laws of physics and all the same laws, of circuitry, and it's fully digital, which, by the way, our world could theoretically be. We'll get into the quantum mechanics stuff hopefully here in a bit and talk
You
about.
have
some of
to
the
be able to
details there.
put feelings into a computer program to make
or at least
make it work.
Yeah, I don't know that feelings are even necessarily the big barrier. Once you have consciousness, I suspect that feelings are probably just a hop, skip, and a step away.
Well,
Hop, skip, and a jump.
but animals have, like, really dumb animals have feelings. Like, you poke them, they hurt.
My old
Yeah,
Like,
think
there's a
that-
threat of.
Then, if anything, that
But
makes
that's
feelings
relatively-
even less.
Yeah, that's relatively easy to code though, because I mean that's
Okay.
responding to stimuli. So if you can code pretty easily in a game, you have an AI character in a game. If they hear a noise, they'll turn around. If you shoot at them, they get angry at you. There's ways to use.
But that's a simulation of. That's simulating the response of feelings. Those characters don't actually have feelings.
No, I know,
Yeah.
but I'm saying, but if you create a person, if you create a being that's conscious, yeah, I think that comes with consciousness. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's relatively easy to create those feelings in a fake character. So someone who is actually,
But you're
can
not
feel
creating
those things.
feelings in a fake character. You're creating a behavior. Like, it's not actually feeling fear, which is causing it to respond that way.
Well, let's look at it like
And-
this. Let's look at it this. Let's say that we find a way to map the human brain, and then we find a way to what's it called when you print something? Then my brain.
Printing.
Okay, when you can 3D printing. Let's say so we 3D print the brain, and we are able to basically, make it function like a brain, right? We start shooting. We find a way to ultimately, like, we put it in a body and we find a way we Frankenstein it or whatever, right? This is obviously far in the future, but if we are able to just basically replicate the brain, then we know for a fact that the brain operating under normal circumstances has, sort of generates the sensation of feeling. And so all you need is the sensors on the body and the brain interpreting these things in that way, and boom, you've got feelings. So the question is, if you can generate a digital world that has those same sort of receptors with a consciousness operating as if it is interpreting whatever those sensors are in that way, then boom, you've got feelings. I mean, the knife going through the hand is a digital knife through a digital hand, but the brain, if it is actually conscious and is actually functioning the way a brain functions, it's going to interpret that as feeling. I think would be the argument. I mean,
Well, I think that there's some terror behind that idea, or like if you think people recoil at the idea of you're living in a matrix, you told those same people, well, not only that, your feelings
Your
of
feelings
love
are bullshit.
are just purely a chemical, calculated reaction.
People don't like that.
Like the people that you love, or like the sadness you feel, it's all just like like you were describing, this level below us. Like if we're the level below something else, this is just programmed into us. And
I don't think it matters. In my mind, I don't think that matters because I mean, ultimately, with that kind of stuff, what does it change? You still end up feeling the same way. Like, you still have those feelings. Ultimately, they're influenced by a machine or something, something above us. But does knowing that change how you feel love or feel hate or any of that stuff?
I think the follow-up might be that no, technically, and I mean, you could explain how it's like, oh, you know what, the pain you feel is actually, your brain is just designed to do, or people with depression, right? It's like, well, you have a chemical imbalance, perhaps, right? Like that is just a physical thing that creates a physiological thing, right? So, what I think might be the relevant factor is not necessarily telling them the way that their feelings are generated, but telling them that their feelings have been generated by some 13-year-old programmer in a basement and you're part of a fake world and it doesn't mean anything. That's where it suddenly, I think, strikes. So I don't necessarily think it's the way that the feelings are generated. It's whether or not those feelings have any purpose or value.
yeah, 'cause
Right, I guess
I would agree with you on like a kind of logistical, operational basis of like, well, does that change my like Monday through Friday if I decide that like, this is all just ones and zeros?
Right.
I'm not gonna like, love people in my life any less. That is like at least subjective within my kind of subjective world and worth subjectively enjoying.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
Eat that mic, Stuart. Now that you've finished what you have to say.
Okay. I will.
So what got me to bring that up is I think pain is like the foundation of life, at least a theory I'm working on, because
Kind of
you
depressing.
have to. Well, if you don't feel pain, like pain
It's all about
is a signal
avoiding
that
pain.
you. Well, it's like a signal
Tells you
that
something's
something
wrong.
in you wants to live, because pain can kill you. Like pain, whenever you're in pain, something can kill you, and so just the fact that we feel pain means that something in us wants to exist. So in this simulation or whatever, you're going to have to give the characters pain so that they will want to do anything.
I wonder if that's. I mean, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but I wonder if that's necessary. Because in theory, for an animal, that's necessary. Because an animal has no like you can't explain to an animal why a certain scenario, like why fire is dangerous necessarily. They won't understand it, but they feel the heat and then they learn it, and it's sort of, if it's instinctual, okay, fine. But I wonder for a human if you could simply replace certain parts of pain, or maybe even all pain, with some sort of just like brain warning. Like, you know what I mean?
Like a flash
Lights
of red.
going on.
Brain warning.
I
Brain
mean,
warning.
right, you wouldn't want to do it with all things, right? Because like, you need the reaction. But let's say that you could also program a replacement for pain that was the reaction. So when I put my hand on a hot stove, I don't have to feel the pain, because there are some people who literally
Yeah,
can't
you
feel
get a
pain,
text
right?
message when you put your hand on the stove that says "quit."
Stop, you idiot.
Yes.
It's certain. No, I think, but let's say for example, I programmed into my brain, I put my hand on a hot stove, and this could actually even be better, because it takes a while for the pain, to get acknowledged, and then I have to pull it off. But if instead of feeling the pain, my brain pulls my hand back immediately as soon as it senses it, which I guess would require the same delay. But as soon as it senses it, you pull the hand back, and then you get some sort of alert. I mean, again, I don't know how. I guess it wouldn't be a text message
But why are you pulling the
Why
hand
not?
back?
Why not?
because you're feeling pain.
No, in that case, it would be because you're doing damage to your body. If you're getting this warning, the reason you would pull your hand away is because, I don't want to screw up my hand, not because you're feeling the pain.
And why do you care about your body if not pain?
Because it could stop me
like-
from doing things that I wanted. If my hand doesn't work properly, I can't drive or masturbate or do or do
Weird
whatever.
choice, but
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Similarly, I can't go out and play
What
tennis.
else is
I mean, I
there?
can't do
Right.
things. Yeah, I
And
can't
tennis. Yeah, there's tennis too.
do tennis, right? I can't. Well, yeah, there's
Yeah.
also
But
that.
mostly-
That's something. I guess people do that during the day. That's something that, that is fulfilling to me that I wouldn't be able to do if I burned my hand too badly. So,
But part of why you're so excited when you run really hard for a ball and hit it is because you didn't fall down and hurt yourself. There's like a pain
a
relation.
tiny fraction of it, perhaps, and it's yeah.
Like and a part of the reason why when you drive your car somewhere and get there safely is pain related.
I mean, maybe, but if I hit the ball into the net, I'm bummed, I'm disappointed. But but and likewise, if I hit the ball and I hit a winner and then I fall and I scrape myself, I don't give two craps about the scrape. I'm super pumped that I just hit that winner. No matter how much it hurt, I'm pumped.
I think your adrenaline's also kind of like overloading your pain sensors at a point too.
Well, maybe, but let's say it wasn't, and I actually have to feel legit pain. I'm still happy I hit that winner. I mean, now at some level of pain, of course, it takes over, and then you're kind of like, if I break my wrist, I'm not thinking about the winner.
I don't even know if the game would exist if pain wasn't into the fabric of.
You bring like emotional pain
Existence.
into.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I don't know how like physical and emotional pain
So as this relates,
and I don't know how. We may get way too
Well,
derailed on
I
this.
wonder if, and maybe you're getting to this too.
well, as this relates to simulation, I guess the question is like, what is the role of that in? Yeah, why not? Why isn't this simulation just all, eating at the candy shop and just full on pleasure? Why is? I mean, when you think about the human experience, like there are places on Earth that are hell on Earth. I mean, it's just like, what is the point? Like, why is it so god awful in like a open sewer in Nigeria or Haiti? Like, why does that even exist? If this is actually, this brings me to something I wanted to bring up in this
They might
podcast.
be NPCs, by the way. I was like,
Yeah, it's fine.
Oh.
It's just leftover
probably
code.
Nice.
probably the most awful thing I've ever said in my life, but I'd just like to point out it's possible.
Guys, it's fine. The misery,
Well,
misery you're experiencing is just an experiment in a code.
You could actually expand that out and this goes back to the you only know yourself as that you can only prove that you are yourself conscious and not everyone else. It could be that if everyone else is an NPC right now, except for the people you're interacting with are real conscious beings. Everyone else is just background game noise.
No, it could be. I mean, we don't know. Well, we don't know if the simulation can be paused, if it can be restarted, if you can jump in with a history. I mean, for all we know, the five of us have just basically signed up for like 2 years of this cool video game that we can play in an hour. Where it's like, hey, we all
you
jump
have a back
in.
history and everything. It's
Yeah.
like, hey, do what you can.
Yeah.
There's a
like
Rick
that.
and Morty episode that deals with that too.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that, and we should have actually all watched that before this. But the Roy game,
Yeah.
in Rick and Morty, is
yeah.
like kind of haunting.
10 minutes and 80 years. Or
It's
something like that.
unbelievable.
Yeah, basically, like Morty gets plugged into this game where he lives an entire life of this guy.
And they make fun of him because he's so boring. He's
Right.
an accountant or some bullshit.
Right, and then but he has like a devastatingly bad life, but doesn't realize that he's playing this character, and then Rick pulls him out, and Morty's completely screwed up because he thought he just like killed himself in this game because his life is horrible, but it was only 10 minutes and it's just a simulation.
Okay, so here's the idea that I wanted to bring up that a friend of mine, this whole conversation came up, and he said, as a kind of starving artist, he's like, the simulation theory is kind of like a rich guy's kind of thing to think about, because
That's exactly what my dad said.
like if you're struggling to kind of put food on your family, then like who like. The only a guy with a Tesla thinks about like this being a simulation.
Totally.
It's definitely a first world problem. I think,
like if you're, because if it is a simulation, then the guy who's like, really struggling wherever he is in the world, it's like, what a stupid simulation.
Well, it depends on what the purpose of the simulation is. I mean, maybe they're trying to learn about human behavior under different circumstances, you know what I mean? Or what's a model of the world? Like maybe our planet is modeled after their planet and they want to know what the future looks like, so they run a bunch of simulations. I mean, there's a number of different things that could exist, and it does, assuming that everybody in the world is a conscious being, for a lot of people, it definitely sucks. There's no getting around that. But I think you do have to ask the question of like, well, what is the potential purpose? So, I mean, but I mean, look, so is space flights. Nobody in sub-Saharan Africa that's like trying to freaking, day-to-day survive is thinking about like, well, we got to get our asses to Mars. Yeah, how are we getting to Mars? Because you know what I mean? If Elon Musk if Tesla doesn't stay up, how are we going to solve climate change? It's like nobody cares about that crap, but that doesn't mean they're not real.
but I will say for that, in those cases, a lot of times that technology trickles down. So in theory, they might not. Somebody in sub-Saharan Africa might not care about going to Mars, but the technology that we come up with getting there might one day actually trickle down to them and help them.
It benefits them, but they're not spending any time thinking about it.
No. And it doesn't really make sense for them. In their immediate life, doesn't really. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to make the case for the fact that we're in a simulation. So, and I started with this, right? So
we're already convinced, John.
I'm going to reconvince you.
For everybody else.
This is let me actually give you I'm going to give you the argument as Bostrom actually made it. And I've seen it a number of different ways, but it's 3 basic arguments, and at least one of the following statements is very likely to be true according to the simulation. 1, the fraction of I'm going to give this 2 different ways, so bear with me. 1, the fraction of human-level civilizations that reached a post-human stage, that is, one capable of running high-fidelity ancestor simulations. Ancestor simulations, by the way, is the name that they give to a simulation that basically
Going back in time.
Yeah, that has a whole history of sort of development of whatever. That the fraction of civilizations that reach that stage is very, very close to 0. Or, number 2, the fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running ancestor simulations is very close to 0. Or, 3, the fraction of all people with our kind of experiences that are living in a simulation is very close to 1. Now, it's a little bit confusing, so I'm going to break it down.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Let me explain.
Post-human civilization?
Post-human is this idea that we have the technology to create a simulation.
This is 10,000 years from now.
Yeah, because
million,
the idea is that we have evolved and advanced, and we are well beyond our stage of where we're at now.
Okay.
We may require the resources of a Dyson sphere. I'm sure you guys know a Dyson sphere, but for
I'm a
people who
nerd,
don't know,
yes.
it's a device that basically surrounds the sun that is able to harness the radiation.
Which level are you talking about?
It's also a
In
vacuum.
that instance, I'm talking about level 2, which I get to, but I've got a whole thing on the Fermi paradox and all the different levels of civilization and everything. Maybe we'll get into that. If not, it's a whole other podcast. And side note, I would like to do a podcast on that idea of pain. I think that could be a whole podcast.
Yeah.
But getting back to this, so the number one idea is that human civilization is unlikely to reach a level of technological maturity capable of producing simulated realities, or such simulations are physically impossible to construct. So it's possible that you can't actually construct a simulation that harbors, that genuinely generates and contains consciousness. That's a possibility.
Fair enough.
That seems disappointing, though.
Not with
it is
that
what it is.
attitude, you're not going to fucking build a dry simulation.
So that's one instance, and that, by the way, is where the Fermi paradox comes potentially into play. Is this idea of, well, are we the first people to even reach? Or first of all, are we even the only civilization in the universe? If we're not a simulation, are we the first in the universe?
We're definitely number one.
To reach, yeah, we're definitely number one. And the other, of course, being like, well, what, if I guess, yeah. Fermi, we'll go into the Fermi. I don't want to get too far into it,
Make
but
the universe great again.
make the universe great again, indeed. So, and number two, the idea of number two is that a comparable civilization reaching such a technological status will not likely produce a significant number of simulated realities, or any at all necessarily, because they just don't have the interest. Maybe they have a reason to divert computational power elsewhere. Maybe there are ethical considerations. They've made it illegal
Doubtful.
or something. Whatever. It is. If it were true, then you would expect that we would not be in a simulation, right? If we're in a simulation, almost that it's reasonable to assume that very probably somebody generated it. Now I know that. I immediately want to take that back because it requires some defense that takes a little bit of time, actually. But
I just want to hear you argue with yourself. So continue.
Well, I'm feeling like we're in your simulation all of a sudden, like short-circuiting.
You are in my simulation. I am.
There's some weird beeping noises coming out of John's
I'm making the
head right
rules.
now.
I'm making the
Steam
rules.
coming out of his ears.
So the first is either that nobody else has ever done it, or that you can't do it. The second is that that there's a bunch of people that maybe got to the point where they could, and they've chosen not to for some reason. And the third option, that if those two are not true, then the third one is that we very probably are in a simulation. So the idea behind this basically is, and I wrote this down, so I'll read it because it's actually kind of compelling. So if even a single civilization runs a bunch of test simulations to determine different kinds of outcomes for various reasons, maybe they're just running, political simulations or social simulations, etc. They run a bunch of these different things, right? You run a bunch of tests to figure out, well, how many times does this come out, right? You need a certain sample size, etc. And all of those generate conscious beings or existences or whatever, assuming that that's the case. So I'll go on. And each simulation may require millions or billions of people. Then you could easily see how quickly very large numbers of individual consciousness could be created, with numbers such as 100 to 1 million times as many people as are now actually alive in our world today. If you begin to nest these simulations inside of each other, the numbers get astronomical. So if worlds like this exist, the odds that you are, in other words, if simulations are created at this scale, then the number of beings that exist that are simulated
Infinite.
outnumber the actual number of beings by an astronomical number. Because for every one person, for every world, right, that let's say there's 1 billion people or 7 billion people in a world, or 100 billion people in a world that generates millions and millions of similar worlds that are not real.
Per person, even.
Yeah, and you just happen to be a person, an existence in the universe. What are the odds that you are not a simulation? It's ridiculously low because you've got trillions upon trillions of simulated consciousnesses and only 10 billion or 100
That's kind
billion.
of the argument that Elon Musk makes.
Well, yeah, he does. That's why he brought it to the forefront, of course, with this point. Now, you have to be able to not only create these things, but then nest these things. And there is some argument. There is an argument. So we're going to get into some of the things that you like to talk about, Calvin, where the argument goes, anyways, that in order to be able to create a simulated reality, you have to to generate an entire universe in its entirety. You would need the computational resources, ultimately, like the energy of that entire universe. So at some point, there need to be shortcuts taking place. That's the argument. Somebody smarter than I would need to break that down, but I will say that I've listened to people way smarter.
I'll do that.
I've listened to people way smarter than I argue that that's the case. Now, let's assume that that's the case for now. The idea then goes that in our universe there's a great number of things that are not being rendered in their entirety, for whatever reason. Some of them could be, for example, the universe, by the way, is like 90 the observable universe. Excuse me. So the unobservable universe, of course, doesn't have to get rendered because we wouldn't look at it. But it's like 90 billion light years or some totally ridiculous amount of distance across. Having technical difficulties here, Calvin.
That we are.
No sighing into the mic.
I think it's like 28 billion, but whatever.
Well, so in any case, it's way beyond what we could ever possibly travel, because the speed of light is, of course, it is the universal speed limit for starters, and second of all, this makes us, we're assuming all of the physics as we understand it is at least on par with being correct, and we're also probably having to assume that wormholes can't exist. But you could probably make the vast majority of the observable universe two-dimensional. It's just a picture that looks like it's a certain distance ultimately, because we'll never get there. We'll never be able to actually analyze it. And so you only have to make
pixelated.
Yeah, I mean, it could also be, there's also a degree to which, like, okay, well, we're limited in how clear we can get these pictures really far out, so it doesn't need to be perfectly precise in its rendering, right? And there's also a theory that, or I guess part and parcel of or along with that theory anyways, is the idea that what no user in the quote unquote user in the simulation is actually observing doesn't need to be rendered in its entirety. So there's chairs downstairs, there's a bed downstairs in my bedroom that simply is not, it's not there right now. And if I went downstairs, I would see it and it would still be in the state that I left it. But it's not actually there right now. It's not being rendered right now.
Like video games.
Yeah, just like
That's
video
what I'm saying
games.
about like
Exactly like video games.
Everyone else outside this room could be an NPC right now.
Well, they don't even have to be. I mean, even if the computer had to render everything that everybody was looking at on the planet, if you only had to render those things in their entirety,
It's not that big a deal.
it's not that big of a deal, because even this chair is made up of a vast, a number of atoms, but I don't have to see the atoms at
Unless
the
you're
moment.
looking at it
Unless I'm
in
looking at it through a
electronic-
microscope, and when I look at it through that electron microscope, then they would render that. And in fact, interestingly enough, they might not even have to render the rest of the chair, just what I'm seeing
Yeah.
through the microscope.
Oh, absolutely.
So at the end of the day, the computer game can ultimately decide what needs to be rendered at what point in time, and you can use vastly fewer resources to generate it. So and then when you nest them, then you can nest them much more easily, because you're using significantly fewer resources in each turn. But there is at least a theoretical limit on how many you could nest if that statement is true, that the computer generating this world has to have at least enough sort of energy or capacity or whatever as the universe is trying
Which
to
I
generate.
don't buy. You're thinking that a society a million years from now or 10,000 years from now isn't going to be able to figure out ways around that besides just what we talked about? That sounds ludicrous. To me.
I agreed. There's two arguments I have against that notion, by the way, that I never heard argued from. I didn't do. It's not like I did, months worth of research, but I did a lot of research. And I was
These
interested
are all
to
just
find-
original thoughts. From
Yeah,
John.
I'm going to give you a couple original thoughts that I had real quick. One of them was that, right, is that it basically is that, like, well, this assumes that this assumes, for starters, that the laws of physics and energy, et cetera, that are programmed into our world exist in the world that runs the computer that generates us, which is not necessarily the case. Two, it also assumes that there is that they haven't simply just advanced to the point where they can surpass this idea that we think is true for us now, but with enough technology it could not be. It could be different. There's also an interesting thought that occurred to me that, well, what happens if somebody inside of a simulated reality comes up with a technology that's more advanced than the outside reality?
Ooh.
Yeah. That's where it starts to get a little bit interesting, is if the reality is allowed to take a different path and it ends up with the technology beyond.
Maybe that's the whole purpose of the damn thing.
Well, it could be, right? I mean,
Wow.
and then if they observe it, if the simulators observe the simulated creating this thing, then they could simply adopt it in theory. But the point is that maybe you could actually find a way to generate more power inside. And then the last one that I'll argue is that when I create SimCity and I create a bunch of power plants in there, and all of those cities run on those power plants. Now this might not be a great example because it's not real power, but I wonder if it's like, man, are we just overthinking this thing? Is it possible that if you're really just a bunch of ones and zeros, then maybe maybe the electricity that runs all our stuff uses up as much electricity as a SimCity game? I mean, That one requires a little bit more understanding than I understand, right? But like, I don't, nobody in my SimCity world sits around and says, "Hey, your computer's too slow. We can't even generate enough electricity to run this city." It's like, well, yeah, nobody says that because it's not real power.
Well, they can't even conceive of how much power is available.
One level up.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, all that, like comparing possible simulations and everything to our current universe seems
Absurd to even try.
Yeah, that doesn't.
Wait,
like,
why is that so absurd?
Why would it? Why couldn't you create?
That's what we're here for. That's what
You're
we're
in the
doing.
wrong podcast.
Yeah, I mean, why couldn't you?
Well,
Why is reality only on the terms that we live in if we are simulated? Which is like kind of arrogant of us to look at the at the whole thing having to apply to what happens on this plane in terms of
one
Yeah,
level.
I would agree with that.
One level
Like,
up, everything could be different.
Yeah,
Well,
like John's
I don't
saying,
say
it's like
everything, but
he's
I
like,
think-
well, on one hand he's saying, I can't imagine a computer running this giant simulation, but then he's saying like, well, but yeah, like my sim characters probably couldn't imagine the wackiness and like the capacity that we have in this level of reality. So yeah, maybe what you're saying is why not? Why not the next level that has like
Unimaginable
infinite free
power.
energy?
Or free, yeah.
Yeah.
Like one of our stars or galaxies is like turning on a light bulb for them. Like they don't give a shit.
Here's a question. So what? So are the people that are creating, if there are people creating simulate like people on top, then are they gods?
I mean, effectively, I would say
Yeah,
And-
effectively, yes.
What created them?
Well,
Fractals.
this is something I hinted at earlier in the podcast. That's true. What did you say?
So it's fractals. It's all
Fractals,
fractals,
yeah.
all the way up and down. It's all fractals.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's at some point you have to ask the same questions that we are already asking here, and that's why I sort of suggested, well, maybe the true, if you want to call reality the highest level, let's just say, right? We should come up with a better name for it, but let's just say that that's reality, the true reality, we'll call it. If you want to say that in the true reality there actually is a God, and that maybe they've programmed this idea of the true reality in here for various different reasons, including the possibility of fidelity of the simulation or something like that, then at the end of the day, once you get to the true reality, once you get to the top of all of this long line of simulations, all of those same questions still apply, and they could very well be true. You still have a question of first mover. You still have a question of what is the self-existent entity? How does all this stuff exist? Is there a God? Has everything just self-existed, et cetera, et cetera? So it doesn't eliminate those questions. It just makes them a little bit more complex.
I heard something really interesting. If there is a God, could he make a boulder so heavy that he couldn't pick it up?
See, I don't think that question's all that interesting actually, because sorry.
Go ahead.
For the following
That's a
reasons.
really terrible thing
Thank
to
you,
say.
John.
I found that. Let me rephrase that. I found that question also very interesting, but the solution that I discovered made it just uninteresting for me. Let me.
Okay.
So sorry, didn't mean to sound like a total douche there.
My God.
Yeah, I'm like.
What
too
solution
late.
did
I'm
you?
busy. I'm busy. Yeah. So the solution basically is that an all-powerful God is only all-powerful within his nature. So a God, yes, like what we determine to be all-powerful is somebody who can do anything, and then of course we immediately assume that he can't do something that's contradictory, like make a boulder so big that even he can't move it. But in fact, that is not what I think. Such a God can't. By that definition of all-powerful, no, such a God cannot exist. But a God who is all-powerful within his nature or within his character or within his sort of, I don't want to get like too circular, but within his power, right? Quite frankly, no, he simply can't create a boulder so big he can't move it. Because it's...
See, I was thinking the opposite, that he could do that in order to give him something to do. And that
That's
is
an
why
interesting thought.
these these simulations are going to have something to do. And that the gods on top could program
It's a more
infinite
more
loop.
exciting answer.
Well, I
than
think
the
some
one-
people would
Yeah,
even
I was
argue
thinking
that like
total opposite.
what we're all experiencing. You're saying like what you follow the fractals all the way to the top. Like what's there, or I think there is a school of thought that is this kind of fracturing is like this aboard single creator entity who's just like, well, what is there to do? Well, shatter into a million pieces and just live and die, and if you go all the way up, yeah, we're all one. We're all just part of this kind of nebulous soup, and that is a school of thought. I'm not advocating for that, but perhaps that's what it is. Perhaps, actually, there's a school of thought that's like that. There's a God who's just like so sick and tired of being a singular bored kind of solo entity that fractured into all these little pieces for itself to experience itself on its way to just like non-existence. It's like, let's just fracture into a million pieces and just be done with it. Maybe that's what we're experiencing. Interesting.
I like it.
Yeah.
There's a great quote from one of the guys. So there's a 2 hour debate actually that was quite interesting. I found a lot of great resources, by the way. There's a 2 hour debate that took place called the Isaac Asimov Memorial Debate from 2016, and they bring a ton of really smart people in. And the discussion, the debate is: are we living in a computer simulation? So there's just really, if you have the time, it's worth listening to because it's cool. And it covers a lot of the similar stuff, but it goes really deep into some of the nitty gritty, which is great. But there is one guy that his name's Max Tegmark. I think it's Tegmark, maybe. He's a he's a cosmologist from MIT, and he says, if you're not sure at the end of the day whether you're actually simulated or not, my advice for those people is to go out and live really interesting lives and do really unexpected things so the simulators don't get bored and shut you down.
That's awesome. Yeah. I love that. So, okay, and that is the question that I feel like it'd be worth us discussing to, like, you know, as long as we're doing this, like, what are the implications of this? And if, let's say we assume that half of us assume this is a simulation and half assume that it's not, where do we start knocking on the kind of edges of this? Where do we start trying to break the system, like, down, not in like an anarchist way, but just in a kind of like, where do you start kind of trying to poke holes in this?
Well, that's kind of dangerous deal too, because if like there's a mass awakening, if we are in one, all figure it out. They're probably pulling the plug because that's not the point.
Well,
probably.
I would think it
would be awesome,
and I think we have absolutely no recourse. I mean, we can't get out of the machine that we're living in. There's nothing.
Right.
What's the I mean, maybe they want to save power for something else, but it sounds like they have mostly an unlimited power source. So why would they shut it down? They might as well just either let it go until everyone's gone and dead.
I guess I assume their
It's probably
intentions.
why.
I have no idea.
That's probably why there's a flood every 26,000 years.
Yeah,
It's like
ice ages.
we start
reset.
waking up,
Yep.
and it's
Yeah.
like, you know what? Just
We're gonna
scrap
go on ice
it.
age.
This version is getting too persnickety.
There is
flood it.
So there's 2 interesting arguments that I learned about. One about the Fermi paradox.
Way ahead of us.
Yeah, I've read a lot on this stuff. It's kind of cool. No, but I mean this is cool because, there's just so much to explore. There's just so much to explore.
And it brings you to so many other places.
It really
too.
does. Yeah, you can go down so many rabbit holes. But so part of the reason, so the Fermi paradox, there's an argument of like, where are all these alien civilizations if this is a common thing?
Yeah.
Well, one of the arguments is that there is a type 3 civilization. So there's, just to really quickly explain, there are 3 types of civilizations out there according to the Kardashev scale. It was proposed by Soviet astrophysicist Nikolai Kardashev in 1964. It divides hypothetical civilizations into 3 types: Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3. A Type 1 is a technological level of a civilization that can harness all the energy that falls on a planet from its parent star. And according to that, we are, depending on how you measure it, we're roughly like a 0.7 to 0.73 type civilization, or type point. Yeah, you understand.
Pretty good.
So we can capture 73% of all the energy that comes to us.
Or we utilize that amount of energy.
It's in that ballpark.
Okay.
I don't want to answer without being certain, but I'll let
Which
the
sounds
listeners
absurd. I
let the
bet
listeners
we're
do their own.
nowhere
It does sound a
close
little
to that.
higher than I
Yeah,
would
it
have
does sound
expected.
high. Yeah.
In any case, Type 2 civilization is a civilization capable of harnessing the energy radiated by its own star. For example, the stage of a successful construction of a Dyson sphere, which again we talked about being a device that surrounds a star and captures all the radiation and is able to control it and turn it into energy that's usable by the civilization. A Type 3
My
civilization.
iPhone would charge so quickly.
It really would.
That.
You'd be
Yeah,
amazed.
great, yeah.
Yeah.
Space elevators.
Si-
Space elevators. Look it up.
We're getting there.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. That's another podcast for sure.
Yeah.
Type 3, a civilization in possession of energy on the scale of its own galaxy, as in the entire Milky Way, for example, with energy consumption at roughly 4 to the 10 to the 44 erg per second.
We'll get there.
What does that mean? I don't know, but think about the number that I
like
just
that
said.
word. Yeah,
4
that's
times 10 to the
massive.
44.
Ergs.
So yeah, that's ridiculous. Anyway, so the idea is that one of the possibilities for the Fermi paradox, where'd all the intelligent civilizations go? They should be everywhere. Is that the first civilization to get to a type 3 just went around and wiped out all the other civilizations and just leaves, it just like doesn't bother to wipe them out until they hit a certain point, right? So as soon as you hit a certain like
They can
type 1 or
detect you,
type
maybe.
2, yeah.
They're like, oh,
yeah,
they
or they just, maybe they're just keeping you
surrounded
under
a
watch.
star.
They're not going to bother with
Yeah.
you, and then all of a sudden you hit type 2 and they're like, nope, you guys are done, and they come in and just wipe you out.
Ice Age.
This is a good Cosmo article. Like, where did all the good Type 2 civilizations go? Like, as a young woman, this is really tough. Like, all the good Type 2 civilizations have been wiped out or they're taken.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah, galactic Tinder is just all ugly
Argue
type
that.
1s. There's
Just,
no good type 2s.
argue that.
Yeah. So the point that Nick Bostrom makes is like there's this great quote by him that says, when we are headed the wrong way, the last thing we need is progress. And it's this idea that basically if you have to hit a certain level of progress to get wiped out by that ancient type 3 civilization, you don't want to get there. Similarly, there's also this idea of great filters with the Fermi paradox, which basically says that there's a number of different ways that maybe civilizations end up wiping themselves out, like inevitably, right? Inevitably, they will wipe themselves out once they reach a certain technological level. And there's this great, by the way, there's this great YouTube channel called Kurzgesagt.
How do you
Say it
spell
wrong.
that? How do you spell that, John?
Kurzgesagt.
Spell that for all of us.
Yes, Kurzgesagt. It's obviously German. Kurzgesagt. And
Sounds like it spells.
I assume it's German anyways. Yeah, sounds just it's like spelled just how it sounds.
Yeah.
And they've got great, like really short, like great explanation videos for a lot of these, including the Fermi paradox and are we living in a simulation? A lot of this stuff, really great stuff. Definitely check them out. But anyway, so one of their things on the Fermi paradox makes this case that there's there's a possibility that you eliminate yourself as soon as you create a certain. Actually, so there's a number of different assumptions that they make on the simulation standpoint, but with that we can go over, by the way. But one of them is that in the Fermi paradox, this idea that you basically get to the point where the last line of any truly advanced civilization is, as soon as I press this button, all of our problems will go away or will be solved or whatever. It's like that's the last line of every advanced civilization because there's some technology that gets developed that that we discover, some science that we discover that we don't realize is self-destructive.
That was kind of nuclear energy too, to a point.
I mean that's I think something even bigger than that, like a black hole generator.
For sure.
If somebody accidentally discovers a black hole generator in the midst of trying to discover the secrets of quarks or something like that, oops, I accidentally created a black hole. Boom, we're gone.
That was the big fear about
CERN?
CERN, in Switzerland. Where they're like, man, that thing's gonna create a bunch of
CERN.
black
Yeah,
holes.
but there's no legitimate scientists were ever really concerned about that. I think they said there was a possibility of creating micro black holes, but
Yeah.
they
Still
would have
sounds
gone
pretty
out.
bad.
To me, it sounds
no, but
pretty
they would have
bad.
gone out of existence so quickly that it would have had no effect on anything. But I think there's other great filters where disease or famine wiping out. Another big one I think was the jump from inorganic molecules to organic molecules, and the way that life gets created. And that maybe it just doesn't happen very often in many places.
Did you get into any of that stuff, John, in your research on the idea that there isn't actually any physical reality, that all molecules have space between them, and stuff because
with
like
quantum
in atoms and whatnot.
Yeah, right. So there's this,
Yeah.
and actually there's this really great podcast. I'm just gonna push other podcasts and other YouTube videos. By the way, there's this great podcast with Joe Rogan where he talks with a physicist by the name of. I've got this somewhere.
That's a weird name.
I'll come. Yeah, I'm gonna come up with it. But in any case, it's Sean Carroll, I think, actually, and it's really fascinating. He's a quantum physicist, and he makes this argument that it's like, well, look, so much of quantum mechanics is misunderstood by the mass public because it's lazily explained to them. And he said, the truth is that all of these things that seem quite fuzzy are fuzzy only because we're trying to put mathematical formulas that are quite clear and quite precise, and we're trying to put it into words. Yeah, we're trying to put it into words that we can understand. So he argues, anyways, that this idea that an atom is mostly empty space is just a lazy explanation, that it's not true. And that, for example, an electron cloud, and I may botch this, so listen to the podcast if you get a chance. as I understood it, the idea was that the notion that there's a probability cloud of where that electron might be, and that you shoot and you sort of try and measure it, you try and find out where it is, and then as soon as you measure it, it's someplace else or whatever. Yada yada.
You can't know the time and location at the same time.
That's
Yeah.
what it is.
And so, but the probability field, he says, is the actual reality. He says that the electron that we are trying to measure and its existence, the way we think of it, he says, is not the mathematical. Again, my understanding is that that's not the mathematical definition of it. That the reality of the atom isn't the electron in this probability field, but the probability field itself is the thing. That's what exists in the formula. And so the atom is not actually empty space with this atom. Now, why is it explained in this way, or excuse me, with the electron? Now, why is it explained this way? And he says, well, because people are lazy. And nobody would understand. Like, it doesn't make sense to us to say, yeah, the probability field is what's actually there. We all kind of go, well, what does that mean? That
Still
means,
kind of sounds.
So, like, this is going in a direction that I was hoping it would go. And I was thinking, when you were talking about this chair across from us earlier, I was thinking two things. One, there's a famous quote by Nikola Tesla that I looked up, and it's, if you want to truly understand the universe, you got to think in terms of energy and frequency and vibration. And then the other, like, piggybacking on that was, I don't know if you remember the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats, which was based on a book by a guy named John Ronson. And it's a book about the CIA's investigation into this idea that, like, a chair is not a physical piece. Like, what we understand is, like, physical mass is an illusion. It's only physical in as much as it's, like, its frequency, its vibration, and it's, like,
that's how we perceive it.
Subatomic. It's like when you touch it. But when the CIA was investigating all this, they had guys staring at goats trying to, like, scramble their brains, and they had people trying to run through walls because they're saying, like, well, this wall is only physical-ish.
It's mostly empty space that's all vibrating, so why can't you run right through it?
And I guess, and that is a kind of a tie on to, like, what I was saying is, like, how do we start to kind of knock on the walls of this matrix of, like, if somebody's
I think
speaking of vibration and energy and does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Like, the solid material mass is only solid in as much as we experience it being solid.
It's like golf when you hit, like, someone hits a ball into a tree and they're like, well, that's like 90% air anyways. You'll probably get through that. It's like, no, it's like the ball almost never gets through.
Like, that goes to the Matrix line of there is no spoon. And the Michael Crichton book, the author, they would do spoon
We're
bending.
past the statute of spoiler limitations.
We've ruined a lot of pop culture on this.
They would have, like, spoon bending gatherings where they would just look at a spoon and bend them, and he said it happened. I haven't been to a spoon gathering or spoon bending
Not
gathering.
only did he say it happened, but he said that it was like everyone just reacted like they're like, yeah, this is just what happened.
Who was
like,
it?
Michael Crichton.
He has an awesome biography.
He did a dinosaur movie called Jurassic Park.
No spoilers this time.
Yeah.
I'm a Michael Crichton fan, actually. I now believe that 70% more.
I think his book Travels talks about that.
I've been yelling at you.
You
about
have.
this.
I know. I need to get it now. I need to read it. It's our damn book club that keeps me so busy.
All right, so wait, how do we start pushing on the edges of the matrix?
Oh,
I want to run through a wall.
Yeah.
Well, so they talk about different ways that they kind of think about that you could try to, find. One of the things they say for example.
Oh, sorry. What about the observer impacts reality thing? And
They
does
talk about that a little
does
bit,
that
too.
relate to us being in a simulation, or did that?
So the argument is that it does to an extent. Like it's difficult to. It's clear that one thing we don't know a lot about is quantum mechanics. Like we are
Me especially.
Me especially. Yes.
Mostly
I especially know very little.
us here.
Yes. But yeah, like, consciousness is the only thing we definitely know almost nothing about, and then after that, it might be quantum mechanics, as far as I can tell. Which isn't to say that we know nothing about it, but it's just to say that there's still so much left to figure out, and the fact that, like, we don't even understand quantum gravity. There's still some basic fundamental aspects that don't fit with the vast majority of our theories, except for maybe string theory, I guess, is the one sort of overarching theory that I guess manages to find a way to put that all together.
And that kind of leads into, I was reading articles about there are two scientists that were saying they could basically pretty well disprove the idea that we are in a simulation by looking at some factor of quantum mechanics about like the decay rate of metals and how that is an incalculable number. So there is literally no way to calculate it, which disproves the idea that we're in a computer that would have to calculate this idea.
Yeah,
Unless they
so
threw us that curve.
Bullshit.
yeah. I mean, so there's the interesting thing about some of that is that one of the things that tends to screw up a lot of our calculations is the idea of infinity, and they actually talk about this a little bit in the debate where there's this one of the guys suggests basically that infinity might just be a sort of a creation of a creation of ours to facilitate understanding things that we are not yet capable of either measuring or understanding, or that we don't really like, that the mathematics might actually be there for it, but that that's something that we think for example about infinity as like, okay, let's say we take a piece of matter and we just want to like zoom in on it or stretch it and zoom in.
All right, I'm real retarded. Why does infinity matter?
Well, I think he's talking about something that's immeasurable. And so if there's a decay rate that's immeasurable, there's almost certainly some sort of a limit involved. And if there's a limit involved, it's almost certainly having to do with infinity.
Oh.
So
Okay.
infinity basically throws off all your probabilities, right? So I was talking to David, who made a good point recently where he was talking about like, okay, well, if I have an infinite number of random integers, infinite inside of a set, what is the odd that it lands exactly on one of the numbers? And the answer is 0. So anytime you try and calculate probabilities with infinity, it's thrown completely out of whack, right? Like, so that's the thing is that like we have instances where infinity plays a role, and our math doesn't tend to allow us to really add it up properly. Like infinity makes it so that we can't really generate probabilities of things, for example, that we know have happened in the past or whatever, right? Like that things that shouldn't, like things that can't exist. So there's this. Have any of you guys heard of Zeno of Elea? I was reminded of this while I was listening. Do you know this, right? The paradoxes?
No, I was just gonna say something silly.
Something about Xena.
No,
The Xena Warrior Princess
No,
joke.
I don't even know what I was gonna say. I just wanted to.
You just wanted to make
It
a
just sounded like a cool word.
It was, yeah, it is
Xenophilia?
Zeno of Elea.
Oh, xenophilia.
Yes.
Like the episode of Friends where Joey tries to say French words and
Yeah.
So Zeno of Elea was, I might have actually written this down somewhere to get it actually right. But in any case, Zeno of Elea existed back in around the time of Socrates-ish, give or take. Oh, I do have it written down. 490 to 430 BC, actually. He was a student of Parmenides. And his 3 paradoxes are Achilles and the tortoise. Well, no, he has a bunch of paradoxes, but his 3 most famous are Achilles and the tortoise, the dichotomy paradox, and the arrow paradox. And I don't know, the answers are always a little bit either vague or mathematical, and so it's a little bit difficult to like really kind of understand them for me. But I can at least explain the paradoxes. And the Achilles and the tortoise basically says that, look, Achilles is trying to chase a tortoise. And in order to catch the tortoise, it must, like the full distance of where the tortoise is, it has to get to where the tortoise, or it's trying to pass the tortoise rather, and it has to get to where the tortoise was before it can get to where the tortoise is. But since the tortoise is in constant motion forward, there's always a place that Achilles has to get to where the tortoise was before it can pass the tortoise. And so it can never actually get there. He can never actually pass the tortoise because he always has to get to the point where the tortoise just was before he can get to where the tortoise actually is. There's another paradox that's extremely similar. That's called listen to this one and you'll get it. The dichotomy paradox is extremely similar. And it says basically that in order for it's talking about, his example uses Homer trying to walk from from point A to point B. And in order for Homer to get from point A to point B, he needs to, Homer, by the way, the
Simpson.
Not Homer Simpson.
Oh, okay, right.
Yeah. But the
Thanks for dumbing that down.
yeah, just want to make sure everybody was clear. We weren't talking about the Simpsons. You have to in order to get from A to B, you have to first travel half the distance. Then you're halfway there. In order to get then from there to point B, you have to go half that distance. And there is always, at every single step in that trek, there's always a half distance that you have to trek, that you have to arrive at before you can arrive at the actual distance. And so you will never, because there's an
It's like
infinite
folding
number
a piece of paper in half. Like,
yeah, like in theory, you could just endlessly, right? Like you can endlessly cut the distance in half, and he must traverse that distance.
I feel like there's somebody that's much smarter than I that will give you like a one-line answer. On
Well,
why this is all retarded.
Socrates actually does.
Okay,
Socrates?
But
so I was right.
Well, so there's different ways to. Well, the obvious
It just
answer.
seems so absurd.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is I made it to point B.
Yeah.
Yes, the
But
obvious
I mean,
answer
like-
is that it's not true. Like you don't have to necessarily even.
But I don't want that.
Okay,
Well,
I
give me-
agree, I
give me
agree.
a turtle,
I
and I'll-
agree.
I
Well,
want to understand why this is such a popular paradox because I
It
never.
seems unbelievably like.
because
Sophomore.
This is
because
the
it's
worst
because
paradox.
it seems logical.
I've ever encountered.
It seems logical, and yet it's so clearly easily disproven. And that's why I think it's popular, is because it's hard to explain why it's wrong. The third paradox, by the way, is the arrow paradox, which is to say that if I shoot an arrow and I hit a target, at any one instant in time, where it's literally a point in time, frozen in time, the arrow itself is not any longer than it was, and it is not in any motion in that instant in time. It is not on its way to where it's going, and it's not on its way to where it is. It's not leaving where it is. It's just there.
Froze frame.
If I freeze frame it, there is no motion. And if I freeze frame all of the frames, there is no motion. So between point A and point B, between me and the target, in fact, the arrow simply is not moving, and therefore it can't hit the target because there's never a moment where it's moving. So all of these things.
This guy's an idiot.
Yeah.
The one
This
thing
guy's
that all
the
of these
stupidest old
So
dead
one of the-
guy I've ever encountered.
The
in
drugs
my
back then
life.
were really good.
Yeah. What a the guy needs Netflix or something. What a bored, dumb asshole.
So the
Here, shoot me this arrow. It's not gonna happen.
Yeah.
Just not gonna happen.
so the
It's worse than five guys sitting around and debating
yeah,
whether we're in a
the-
matrix.
We got cool microphones though.
It's
That guy
so true.
didn't know
So they've
shit.
always done this.
yeah, exactly.
At least they played with weapons back then, I guess. That's pretty
I
cool.
suppose so, yeah. But yeah, so the thing that's interesting about all three of these to me is that they all deal with the instance of like the idea of
Time.
infinity and time, absolutely. But time in and of itself is another one of those things that you can sort of, in theory, you can keep breaking it down and. Yeah, well, and that's the idea is that like I think the point that one of the guys makes is pretty decent, where he kind of says, look, we're a little bit lazy. We don't actually have the computational bandwidth. We don't have the mental prowess or whatever it is, maybe, to really understand what's actually going on here. So we talk about infinity. But anytime we actually enter infinity into any kind of probability or calculation, it screws everything up. So this idea of infinity like makes it's great because it makes a really convenient way to understand a lot of these concepts that may not actually in reality exist in the infinite. Including the possibility that you can just keep zooming in more and more and more, or this idea that you can keep having to go halfway. You know what I mean? We know for a fact that, yes, we can divide, in theory, we say we can divide this an infinite number of times between point A and point B. But in actuality, we should be able to say that you kind of, in one sense, you could argue that you can't, because you know that that would, in theory, create this infinite number of points. When we know there's not an infinite number of points, we know there's a finite distance between here and there. I mean, I guess you could say
They
I guess
could both be
division makes it a
true.
little
They
tricky.
could both be true.
Yeah, in theory, that's also a possibility. Like infinity could actually be a thing, and all of these mathematics are missing some aspect to make them work. But the truth is that we could take an infinite set of integers, in theory. Like if you were ever able to get to the point where you could actually pick from an infinite number of integers, then you would have one, and the probability would be 1 in an infinity, and yet 1 in infinity means 0. Like it's not a thing, right? Like you can't.
Well, what are we gonna do about the Matrix this week?
Yeah.
We gotta
get into
we gotta
practical
break out of
solutions.
this
Gotta live your
Matrix.
life, man.
We have gone.
We gotta
down
go
a bit of a
Neo
rabbit hole.
style.
Yeah.
We could probably have a whole podcast. on infinity
That's
if
a
we
really interesting
understood it.
idea, though. Like because we don't know how much we can zoom in on atoms or how deep we can actually look. We don't know if there's a vibrating string, and if we see a vibrating string, can you then
What
parse
if it's
that
just a
into
giant
something
middle
else?
finger?
That would be pretty great.
All
Then
the
I
way
know
down, that's
that
what you find.
Fuck, they're right. Yeah.
That'd
we
be
live in a
great
Rick and
thing
Morty
at the very
simulation.
bottom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They did say that would be one way that we knew, is if like the simulator creators just like put in the sky.
Like a little Easter
Sorry,
egg.
everybody. This has been a simulation. Thank you for playing.
Better luck next time.
Yeah.
Have you guys ever heard of
Simulation
the,
brought you by Windows 35, whatever it is at that point.
Have you guys heard of
Windows
this?
Infinity.
Yeah, Windows Infinity.
We should send this out in like a kind of group chat. But there's a famous short film by Charles and Ray Eames, this couple that designed some of the most famous pieces of
The
furniture.
chairs?
Yeah,
Okay.
everything you've ever seen, like in terms of classic design. It's called The Powers of 10, and it basically starts like with a couple having a picnic in the park in San Francisco or Central Park, And it zooms out by powers of like 10 times 10 times 10. It goes all the way out into the universe, and it comes all the way back to the people. And then it goes in, like, you know, what's 10 times less than like the couple, what's 10 times like magnified from there, 10 times magnified from there. And it gives you like this weird context for our experience. Like what is 10 times below and what is 10 times above magnified. And yeah, I highly recommend it. It's like weirdly haunting and weirdly the powers of 10. Like just look up Charles and Ray Eames, Powers of 10. Like I believe that's what it's called at least. But in terms of like your ability to zoom in, seemingly like 2018, like we're still capable of zooming in. Like we haven't hit rock bottom where there's a big middle finger, which would be amazing. Nor have we hit like a limit to zooming out, which I think supports the fractal theory that like it's endless. It just keeps going. But
I think we could do a whole podcast on the fractal nature of our existence. By the way,
I think this one could have been like 6 hours that we could just break up over like 3 or 4 weeks, and maybe that's what we do explore. Because I feel like we're just starting to get into it, and it's like, my God, it's been
90 minutes. We're at the ending point. Yeah.
How do we end this fractal of a podcast?
End it with a couple quotes.
Middle fingers.
Middle fingers.
Just audible middle fingers.
I'm gonna end it with a couple quotes. One is fittingly from Nick Bostrom. The first ultra intelligent machine is the last invention that man will ever need to make, provided that the machine is docile enough to tell us how to keep it under control. And
sorry, we say it again.
Yes, I will. I didn't say it very well. The first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that man need ever make, provided that the machine is docile enough to tell us how to keep it under control. Yeah. And then
Terminator 2.
Exactly.
And it has an Austrian accent.
Yes. And then the next one is from Einstein, because I feel like this is one of those things where you really have to expand your knowledge of so many different areas, like to fully understand it better and better and better. And all we've really done is begun to scrape the surface, and which I like, and we could probably explore this in additional podcasts. But Einstein has this great quote where he says, "As our circle of knowledge expands, so does the circumference of darkness surrounding it."
Yeah. Yeah, every question you answer opens a new question for the most part. Yeah.
Or 2 new questions, essentially, So I think we ended on that. It's been a good 90 minutes.
Can I propose one last final argument?
Of course,
before we close? I feel like my role is becoming a guy who just ties in weird pop culture to all this. And so it's also a great way to go out. And it's Sunday night, and we're about to watch Westworld. I want to propose that in Westworld, we're actually supposed to identify more with what do they call the androids that are coming to life?
The hosts,
In light of all of our conversations, we might start this series like identifying with the people, but I think over time we're actually supposed to identify with the host, because that's more true to the human experience of like, holy shit, we were waking up.
We gotta wake up.
And who is in charge here?
We gotta shoot him with a.
We gotta murder them. But it's not that black and white.
I'm so glad you tied that back in.
No, I like it.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Well, guys, good
we're
work.
The hosts.
We figured it out. Definitely in the Matrix. Definitely in a simulation.
I love how no one stood up and was like, "No."
Yeah.
We're not. Everyone's like, "Yeah, we're totally, we're probably."
It could have been a 2-minute podcast if we all just agreed we weren't in the Matrix.
Hey guys, everyone shake hands. It's over.
All right.
Go kill those alien bastards.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to The Search for Truth. Join us on our next podcast where we discuss the singularity, or the point in the possibly very near future where artificial intelligence begins to surpass human intelligence, perhaps by epic proportions. What will this mean for us simple-minded humans? The Search for Truth continues.